Welcome back to my shop. Today I'm going to show you how to go from this to this. Everybody with a third gen Camaro or 1978 to 1988 Malibu, Monte Carlo, Grand Prix, etc. is familiar with this phenomenon. As a matter of fact, when I bought my 1986 Monte Carlo SS in 1989, this boot was already broken. I don't know why they made them so poorly, but the boot from a Jeep steering shaft with bellows seems to be a much better design. Disassembly of this type of shaft is not that difficult, but it's cumbersome. The two halves do slide apart. It's hard sometimes. There we go. And then they stop. And you can see inside here there is an indent, and inside that indent there is a flat metal spring. But that's not what's preventing this from coming apart. What's preventing it from coming apart is the end of this shaft, which ends around here, was staked from inside the rag joint end to prevent it from sliding apart. So the way to get it apart is the two pieces have to be pressed apart. You could insert something in here and hammer. If you use that option, you need to use something that's 3/8 of an inch diameter and it's round or narrower. Otherwise you're going to risk increasing the staking. At the top of this end here, there is a round 3/8 inch diameter hole, which is designed for applying a rod or a shaft for pressing it apart. I'll show you how I can press it apart next. To press the two halves of this shaft apart, I made up a 3/8 rod out of two 3/8 bolts, and in the center I put a nut and I tightened these two together and ground this down until it would fit comfortably inside the hole in the rag joint. Mine turns out to be 11 and a quarter inches long, and I think that should be sufficient. And as you push it in past the rag joint, and then feel it there we go. Now it's registered in the top of this half of the shaft down here. Now let's go to the press. I put the rod through the hole in the rag joint, and I've put it into my press, and now let's press it apart. I'm going to have to hold the bottom, and there'll be that spring I told you about that will pop out. To see if I can catch it. Oh, just long enough. This is the spring piece that I was telling you about that will fall out. It sits right here. And here's a little cup in the end for the rod. There's some staking. It needs to be ground down so that it goes together easily. Here's my rod that I made. So let's go back to the bench. Next thing I did was I took off this rubber boot off the end of the lower end of the shaft, and it's very crusty, lots of rust inside. So it's very difficult to slide off. You have to really nurse it off very gently. I was able to get a pocket screwdriver down through this edge to help, but be careful not to poke a hole through the boot. And eventually, when it comes about halfway off, it will just come off completely. But it's pretty filthy. Should be very carefully cleaned out, thoroughly cleaned out. So there's no more rust and junk left in it when you put it back together. Next, this joint's going to have to come off the upper part of the shaft. And try and tease off this clamp. If you break it, it's not the end of the world. It's not really necessary with the replacement boot. So I'll come back once I've taken this apart. In order to separate this CV joint from the shaft, you've got to expand at least two of these pieces folded down here that are holding the boot in place, and then underneath this boot is a washer, and that washer is preventing the insides of this joint from coming out. So I started by cutting this notch out of the rubber that's in the way, and then I can get a chisel in here and start working underneath one of these teeth, I'll call them teeth, to raise it up just enough. Then I can get a big pair of pliers and it can be bent back out of the way. There. Come back after I bend the other one up. I've got this bend started here. Let's finish bending it. That should be good. Now, alright, I've got the other tang bent out of the way, and then you can keep pressing on this shaft until you can pry the remnants of the boot out. And now let's take it over to the bench. Alright, we're back at the bench, and we've bent these two tangs back, two teeth, two tangs, allowing us to get the remnants of this boot out and the guts inside of the joint. And it should just pull out. There we go. And one of the bearings is stuck inside. This grease is really chunky, gritty. Alright, that used to sit here. It's very gritty, gooey. That's nasty. There's two of these square bearings, block bearings, one on each side. And then there's this piece of spring. And the boot and washer will not pull off in this direction. There's a very There's a washer underneath the boot. Right here. And it's just too big to pull off. The earlier shafts that had pieces of injected plastic in the center here to allow them to collapse in a collision, for those you'd have to press out this pin in order to get this apart. But for this style, now you can just pull off the back of the shaft, cut the rubber boot off, and pull it off. And we'll get this off as well. And the next step, I'm going to degrease everything, clean all this junk out of here. There is a little vent hole in the back here on this side, which is why there's grease coming out the back. Very small vent hole. Clean this out, take this off of here, degrease everything, degrease these pieces here. These will be reused. There's hardly ever any wear on between this pieces and this bearing cup here. And then I will media blast this piece of shaft, protecting this top here where these polished shafts are, and I'll media blast this piece as well. Only up to here. I will protect the rag joint area and just clean that rag joint up so it looks nice and fresh. I'm not going to replace the rag joint. There's a lot of hype about these going bad, but I've never seen a bad one yet. I'm not saying there isn't one, but these are pretty darn tight. Alright, when you see this again, everything will be cleaned up. To get the remnants of this, the boot ring here and this clamp, we're going to apply some penetrating oil to the shaft, and it should make it come off fairly easily. There we go. Just had to get underneath. Done. Now I can just compress the piece of rubber here and pop it out of the clamp. There. Now the clamp has not been ruined. The next thing I need to do is, I don't know if you can see here, there's a stake mark here where it's been raised, and on the other side as well, right here. And those have to be ground down. You can either use a file or a bench grinder. I'm going to use a bench grinder, make quick work of it. And the next thing is to media blast. I touched up the stake marks with the grinder on this side and on this side. And you remember how difficult it was to get apart, required a press. Now the pieces just slide in. No problem whatsoever. You may think it's sloppy, well, but that's what this piece does right here. This piece of spring steel, it's meant to remove the backlash, so it makes it snug fit, but it still is, you can still move it in and out by hand just like you could before, just not the stake marks were the only thing keeping you from pulling it completely apart. Before I media blast the parts, I thought I'd just show you the junk I took out of the coupler. All this grease, it's very strange looking, looks like dirt. It's just probably full of dirt and grit. And then the pieces I cleaned up. This is the coupler. And back in here, this is where the steering shaft goes on the steering column. And there is a small, you can't see it here. There you see the little breather hole. Goes out to the back here. So the coupler is all cleaned out inside here. There's just some wear marks from where the bearing block was rubbing it. And these blocks look fine. You see there's 2 grooves in there for the grease. And this other block here. And then this washer, this just sits between the boot and the coupler here on this surface. And then there's this spring clamp, spring clip here. It puts outward pressure on the blocks, keep them pressed up against the sides of the coupler. And then this piece of it here presses up against the washer and prevents the assembly from coming apart without unfolding these tabs. And here they are, fresh out of the media blaster. Nice and clean. This will be painted a silver engine paint, and both of the shafts will be painted with an epoxy satin black. Have to wipe them down with some naphtha or some brake clean to clean them up, get all the dust off of them, and then paint them. And here are the parts now all painted. This is the lower half of the shaft assembly. It's painted in a satin epoxy black. I cleaned up the rag joint so it's nice and clean. It's no longer greasy and dirty. It doesn't look brand new, but it's nice and clean. And the upper part, you saw when it was media blasted before. And then this is the upper half of the coupler, or the CV joint cup. And the next, we're going to start to put on this new boot. This boot is from Fairchild. It's the number D4107. Seems to be a little more sturdier, it's tougher boot than the one I did the last time, which was this numbered boot from Omix Ada, maybe the same as Crown number. It just felt a thinner material. The Fairchild one seems a bit tougher. So we're going to try to slide that on this end of the joint here and run it down past this obstacle. And when we get down in this area here, then we'll start to just dry fit this cup and the 2 bearings and get an idea of where this cup needs to be, and then we'll stop. And we're going to use some soapy water to help this slide along. Don't forget to put the washer on first. It cannot be inserted from this end, only from this end. If it gets boring, I'll probably fast forward this. Okay, it started. soapy water makes a big difference. And once the soapy water dries, then the boot will no longer want to move. It'll stick. Using something like penetrating oil would be or light oil would be a bad idea, because it'll always be there and the boot will always want to slip. Okay, we're close. Now let's put the blocks on and insert it into the cup, and we can see we need to move the boot further down. That is pretty good position, so we'll stop there. Alright, now we'll put some grease in on this pin and inside the blocks, and on the outside of the blocks, and some inside the coupler here. You don't have to fill this entire cavity. The only places there is motion is where the blocks will ride and where this spring clip will ride, which is it just sits in here. There's only one contact point, so it doesn't take a lot of grease. I'm using some nice old high temperature wheel bearing grease. You don't want to use a low temperature grease that's going to melt and then make a mess if the car gets warm. And I forgot to put the spring clamp in there before I put the blocks on. Okay, not a problem. Yeah, it's very messy. I want to make sure I put this piece of the spring clamp against that side where I put the grease. There we go. Next thing we're going to do is I'm going to clean this up where I put fingerprints all over it, and then we're going to work on peening these tabs over. Next I'm going to use this brass drift I've got and start to knock these tabs down so that they're nice and flat like they are on the original side. I've got them started. I'm going to lean this against my chest and work on them this way. think that'll do it. Now these are knocked over, just about the same as the others originally. Moves around nicely. Alright, the next thing we need to do is to put some white grease on this spring and along the shaft, and then insert them together. Before trying to insert the upper half of the shaft into the lower end of the shaft, it's important to know which way it should be clocked. The way it should be clocked is the slot in the lower shaft should be 180 degrees from the square hole in the upper part of the shaft. Like I've got them here. This is pointing down and the square piece is pointing up. I'll insert a copy of the page from the service manual showing the orientation. Now let's lubricate it and put them together. To lubricate the two shafts, I'm going to use white grease. Remember this dust boot, it slides onto the lower shaft. If you put that on first, it's just going to wipe all the grease off. So it's best to put this boot on this upper shaft first, and then grease it up, and then insert the two pieces together, and then slide this boot down until it's comfortably seated onto the lower shaft. And we'll put some grease on the surface for the spring, the tensioning spring. And we'll put the rest liberally on the shaft itself. Once you've got the upper half of the shaft lubricated, let's go ahead and put this cover on the lower half of the shaft. It's optional, but I'm going to put it on to make the job complete. Bear in mind that we're keeping this split in the lower half of the shaft will be 180 degrees away from the square hole in the upper half of the shaft. And we're going to spray some soapy water on this area of the lower shaft here, so that this boot will slide over it easily. Let's put the shafts together. Okay, this boot is now driven all the way in, and these two will compress, and they can compress almost all the way. There we go. Now, I think our job is done. So aside from putting in the bolts and the nut for safekeeping, there's our rag joint end. And looking inside, here's our crimp around the boot. Job finished. Let me know what you think.